live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News, the news you can trust.
Well, it's been a busy news month in archaeology world, so let's jump right in. And today we're going to cover the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. We're going to start off in Oman, beautiful country that I know very well, where dozens of Bronze and Iron Age structures have been discovered. Now, despite Oman's pretty small size, it's got a very diverse and rugged landscape, from the vast desert in the west known as the Empty Quarter to the very mountainous and broken up northeastern part of the country, full of valleys and craggy mountains. And also, despite its small size, it's full of archaeology. Now, this is probably due to the fact that it's, right in the middle of a whole bunch of cultures and empires and histories that it got mixed up in. It's also very dry, we know, good for preservation. And it hasn't experienced a really large scale ruinous war in a very long time to destroy all of that archaeology. So in some of those valleys in the north and eastern part of the country, you'll find the Aflaj irrigation system, a very ancient system of canals. That's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You'll find crumbling mud brick villages all over the place. You'll find ancient, I think 5,000-year-old tombs at Al Ain. So there's a lot to see. In the west, you'll find ancient ports and cities that were built around the frankincense trade. Now, frankincense is a great incense, which was very highly prized in ancient days. So it was actually one of the gifts of the Magi in the Bible. And it comes from the resin of a tree, which pretty much only grows in Oman, Yemen, and Somalia. So very highly prized. And I actually burned some around here that I got in Oman and brought home with me. Anyway, this is not a travel site visit. So let's stick to the news about these ancient structures that were found, dozens of them. Anyway, as much as has been found, there's a lot that's still unexplored, at least to the trained eye that knows what to look for in this country. So enter the Polish Center for Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Warsaw, acronym PCMAUW, which is not at all helpful, and this is not the Mediterranean, but anyway, they've been active in the country since 2016, and they found some really cool stuff, like a 4,000-year-old game board for a board game. Now, they did surveys of different parts of the country, and the most recent one that we're going to talk about now is the Comaira region in the northeastern part of the country. That's a mountainous region, and this is an area, that's in a valley in this sort of mountainous region. Now, this region, despite its remote location and inhospitable climate, actually had a population boom in ancient times for two reasons. The first one, wadis. Now, that's the same reason much of Oman became an early cradle of civilization. So what's a wadi? A wadi is essentially a deep, narrow valley or ravine where water collects, and with water you can have life. Now, how does this happen? Well, because it's a desert, there's not a lot of soil or trees or plants to sort of soak up the rain when it rains. So it rains, and due to gravity, the water gets funneled down over rocks, and over long periods of time, being channeled to the lowest point, it carves these deep valleys. And then the water collects there, even though it doesn't rain all that much. And when the water collects, you have fresh water, you have oases, and you have life. So there was a lot of that going on in ancient times. You can hear and see wadis all over the Middle East, particularly in Jordan. They have some famous ones to visit. And this is why civilization flourished there. Now, the other thing you had was copper. And what would copper be a major ingredient in? Bronze, as in the Bronze Age. So you had water enabling people to survive in ancient times, and you had copper, which gave them a very important trade good. So there was actually a pretty dense population here in the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age. So what the team found was about 4,500-year-old stone towers, so that's the Bronze Age, and a pretty densely packed, well laid out Iron Age town, about 3,000 years old. Now, these things, if you saw them, would probably just look like a pile of stones. But to the trained eye, the archaeologist's eye, they can actually tell by looking which stones are worked, so have been actually manipulated and shaped by humans, and also how they were worked. Was that done with hand tools, which would have been ancient methods, or with machines, which would be something more modern? So, with those sort of visible cues, that's what sort of catches the team's interest when they do their surveying. I assume they did that through aerial and satellite imagery, and then visually scanned interesting looking places. I don't know that for sure, but that's how these things are often done nowadays over wide areas. Now, nothing particularly really sexy or photographic was found, but there's a few reasons I wanted to share this story with you. First, there's so much archaeology that's out there right under our very noses, and there's not enough people to really go looking for it and to spot interesting things. So, if you're interested, there's actually a lot of ways that you can participate, either by looking at satellite imagery, looking at LiDAR imagery, and we talked about LiDAR in a previous version of the archaeology news, or even doing old-fashioned field walking. Now, there's a few ways you can do this. Just do a Google search. There are projects that I know about where you can sort of scan bits and pieces of the earth through satellite image and record things that you find. Check with your local university archaeology department or your local archaeological society. Second, it's actually the value of pre-reading, studying up, and going with a good tour guide that actually transforms the whole experience of visiting an archaeology site. After all, and take it from me, I've been to hundreds of archaeology sites. If you visit some amazing places like the Palace of Knossos, which I'm going to discuss in an upcoming site visit, or even Stonehenge, sort of the mother lode of archaeology sites, they are really just a pile of stones, disappointing ruins. I mean, even that game board I showed you before, would you have recognized that if you just came across it on a little hike? No. So this is really how to do this kind of tourism the right way. And trust me, having visited hundreds of archaeological sites, it's a whole different experience. Okay, now to the bad. Afghanistan, which has known sort of nothing but war and instability in the last 40 years, is one of the worst sites in the world for archaeocide, destruction of archaeology sites. Who can forget right before 9/11 the destruction by the Taliban of those Bamiyan Buddhas, which at the time were the largest Buddhas in the world? Now, of course, in a war, we first and foremost care about the human toll, but somebody has to care about the archaeology, just as someone has to care about the animals and someone has to care about the environment. So when we're thinking about the ancient monuments and sites, archaeologists are the natural people to be caring about that. So that's what we're going to talk about in this story. Well, through some remote monitoring projects of the type that I just told you about that you can partake in, archaeologists in recent years, since 2018, began to notice something very distressing. So Afghanistan, even in ancient days, was home to a thriving population and civilization. Alexander the Great actually made it all the way there and conquered a people in the Bactrian kingdom. And this is centered in the current day province of the Balkh province. So he conquered Bactria from the Achaemenid Empire, which he defeated. That's basically Persia, Iran. He defeated that empire. And he took, I think she was the daughter of the emperor, Roxana, to be his bride. And there are still people in this part of the world who, some of them have reddish hair, green or blue eyes, that trace their ancestry to the Greeks and claim to be descendants of Alexander. I actually met some of these folks and stayed with them when I visited Uzbekistan a few years. This was a distinct ethnic group who still lives up in the mountains and claims their ancestry from Alexander the Great. Well, this rich civilization at the time, this is the 4th century BC when Alexander was around, actually left behind quite a lot of archaeology in the form of burial mounds and treasure hoards. And actually, a pretty amazing one was found very nearby where we're going to talk about now. Now, what the archaeologists began to notice, again in the late 2010s, was the destruction and looting of a lot of these mounds. And since I'm talking about 2018, that was before the Taliban returned. And then it happened after the Taliban returned, which I think was in 2021. So under both regimes. I'm going to show you what this looked like, and these photos are all courtesy of the BBC. The remote monitoring team found about 200 sites that had been damaged, and they actually have on camera bulldozers and other earth moving equipment in the act. So they caught them with their hands in the cookie jars, but no punishment because they're not on the ground. And, because of the war and poverty in this country, no one has really gotten in a long time to really examine these things. And what it really amounts to is a wholesale destruction of the material culture and heritage of this part of the world. And unfortunately, probably the only way we will know if any riches were found is by monitoring auction houses and antiquities dealers in major European and American cities, because that's often where these things wind up. And that's why it's really important not to buy any unprovenanced antiquities. That's been very much in the news lately, especially with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a place I knew very well, having grown up in New York, having to sell, give back, return so many items in its inventory in recent years. However, what's lost forever and is more important than the shiny stuff is the knowledge. And as viewers of this show will know, a lot of that knowledge is found in sort of microscopic particles in the soil. So if you destroy the mound, you lose all of that. And that's really a shame for future generations of Afghans who won't now understand as much about their own history and culture, which is lost forever. And that's often a unifying factor in a country, especially that's as divided and split up into different sort of groups and tribes as Afghanistan is. And of course, the tourist dollars, the desperately needed tourist dollars that they might have earned from this one day once the country eventually stabilizes. Now, unfortunately, this is often very common in conflict zones where there's poverty, and oftentimes it's people's only meal ticket is selling, looting antiquities, which also, by the way, is why Afghanistan is like the most important source of opium in the world, poverty. That's often one of the only ways these people who are in very desperate situations can get ahead. However, in this case, we know that it was earth moving equipment and bulldozers and those big shovel trucks that did this, not people carrying shovels. So that means whoever did this actually had access to money. So these were probably these local warlords and other poobahs that, really control a lot of the little local areas in Afghanistan. Now, for the record, the Taliban denies everything. They actually claim that they've been enforcing antiquities trafficking laws and catching people. But in any event, we know the stuff is being stolen and these mounds are being destroyed, and the people who are doing that have means. So hopefully something can be done at some point to stop this. But in a place like Afghanistan, there's not that much hope. Anyway, now to the ugly, royal tombs. Now, these royal tombs are beautiful, but sometimes what was found in them is not so beautiful. We're sticking with Alexander the Great and actually his family tomb. So Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, and that was from the Macedonian province of Greece, not the country now known as North Macedonia, which, Greece and North Macedonia almost came to war over the name, so they take it quite seriously. Anyway, so Alexander was from the Macedonian dynasty. He himself was buried in Alexandria, named after him, in Egypt, but his tomb has been lost, although there are people still hunting for it. Anyway, in 1977, his family's big burial complex was found in near a village called Vergina, which is near I think it's the second largest city in Greece, called Thessaloniki. Great food. And I actually just, in the past year, went to both North Macedonia and Thessaloniki. So yeah, near the village of Vergina. Try saying that 10 times fast. Uh-oh! Now, based on the elaborate nature of the site, the finds, the dating, archaeologists knew these were, this should be royalty, and they knew it was the time of Alexander. They just never quite knew who was who. Well, thanks to some new interpretation, which is informed by a lot of science and actually historical sources, a team has claimed to have identified Philip II, that was Alexander's father, his newborn son, and wife, which was another woman, not Alexander's mother. In fact, I think she was younger than Alexander himself. Philip had quite a few wives and different baby mamas. So the bones that were found on the site, of course, were analyzed and compared to the written histories of the time. Now, even though this was 2,400 years ago, the Greeks actually wrote a lot of stuff down. A lot of it survived. And because this was about Alexander the frickin' Great, who conquered more of the world than anyone else had until that point, there was a lot written about him. Now, what's new here is the bones, in addition to being subject to advanced osteological analysis, were also subject to macrophotography, basically super close-up photography, and radiographs, which are kind of X-rays, and analyzed that way as well. All right, so here's the ugly part. In the first tomb, which had been heavily looted, I think even in ancient times, there was a scattering of bones, again, because the site had been looted. And the bones were identified to be those of an adult male, an adult female, and a newborn baby. And this would basically speak very strongly for Philip II, his wife, Queen Cleopatra. No, not that Cleopatra, a different one. And the newborn baby who she had, who actually written sources say were all murdered. And number one suspect in the killing, Olympias, who would be Alexander the Great's mother. What would have been her motive? Her motive would have been to remove another claimant to the throne and put her own son on the throne. And if that was her motive and she was the one behind it, she succeeded, because Alexander the Great, before he was the Great, became the king succeeding his father. So the new analysis aged the adult male at 45 years old, which actually matches up very well with Philip's supposed age of 47 when he was assassinated. Remember, he was Alexander's dad. Previous analysis had put the age of those remains at 25 to 35 at the time of death. But that was based purely on dental analysis. So we do know there were some teeth found among those bones. Moreover, some examination of the leg bones, because there was a pretty complete leg, I believe, they showed a sort of injury, a fusion at the knee, which would have caused a very, very uneven gait. And that also matches the written sources tracing to Philip, because Philip was supposedly lame, as they called it back in the day.
LeMay?
Also, the fact that this particular tomb, and there were several other tombs found, the fact that this particular one was not particularly elaborate also speaks to the idea that this was Philip's. You see, when Alexander took over, it was obviously in a time of turmoil because the king had just been assassinated. And as we know, there would very, very quickly be some wars, which Alexander used to quickly build his empire. But the point is, if he took over in a time of instability with wars on the way, he wouldn't have had money or really the time to focus on building an elaborate tomb. So that also suggests that it's Philip's tomb. The earlier interpretation of the human remains at time of death being 25 to 35, as well as some ancient texts which suggested that Philip had been cremated, that led this identification of these remains to be a different family member. But now the new study, re-aging the human remains and actually re-examining those historical sources and claiming that they were mistranslated, that it didn't necessarily say that Philip had been cremated, that's what changed the interpretation to, yes, this is Philip II and his wife and newborn son. A nearby tomb, which is much more elaborate, houses a much more complete skeleton of a man with no signs of significant injury. And that would actually make more sense for Arrhidaeus, who was Alexander's brother who succeeded him. Now, the written sources aren't that specific, but Arrhidaeus actually had some kind of mental handicap, which means he wouldn't have really gone into battle and hence wouldn't have sustained a lot of injuries in his life, which again suggests the skeleton is probably his. The fact that it's more elaborate is normal for normal for a monarch, and we explained why Philip II's would have been a relatively poorer tomb. Previous analyses of this particular skeleton, the more complete one, had suggested there was an injury to the eye, somewhere in the skull around the eye, which would have made it a lot of sense for it to be Philip, because Philip actually had supposedly sustained an eye injury with an arrow. Now, this has been disputed by the new analysis that claims that that supposed injury is really just a normal anatomical feature, so that means it's not Philip. Now, going back to Arrhidaeus, he also died by assassination at 39, which is consistent with the aging of this particular skeleton. And guess who supposedly had him killed? You guess it? Olympias, Alexander's mother again. She really was an ancient femme fatale.
You hesitate, she will strike.
But don't worry, she actually also got her own, as she was stoned to death by the families of a lot of her victims. Pretty gruesome, pretty ugly, these ancient Greeks. Jeez. Well, anyway, ugly story, but beautiful use of archaeology and science, and matching that with historical sources to try to solve a historic mystery, which is what I said a lot of archaeology is. It's being historic detectives.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
However, this is all pretty new and it's still somewhat disputed, so watch this space. We'll see how this debate shakes out. Finally, to the beautiful, and I'll make this short and sweet. We're going to go to Staffordshire in England, where a metal detectorist found a 3,000 or even 4,000-year-old dress clasp. So it's from the Bronze Age and made of gold. Now, we can't date it better than that without more context because it's very difficult to date gold. While not overly elaborate, there's a simple beauty in its clean lines and simplicity and symmetry. And actually at about 5 inches, 13 centimeters, 4 ounces, 115 grams, it's not too small either. But why is this worth mentioning on such a busy archaeology news day? First, it's just one of 7 found in Britain, meaning it's really rare. Second, it was actually believed to have been made, these kinds of dress clasps, in Ireland, which shows that even in this very, very long ago time, in this very, very far-flung corner of the world, there was still pretty long-distance trade way back in the Bronze Age. But finally, the fact that it's gold, the size of it, it's definitely a treasure, meaning it falls under the UK Treasure Act.
Treasure bath! I'm going to have a treasure bath! Treasure bath!
Now, it's complicated, but what that essentially involves is that public institutions like museums have first dibs on purchasing the item so that it can be preserved for the public. Now, that Treasure Act, what it defines as treasure, has recently been expanded because there was a lot of stuff slipping through the cracks that wasn't, treasure as we think about it, like gold, but maybe something slightly less valuable in terms of monetary value, but rich in information and, for the value for the public to see it. Remember, it's not all about the Benjamins. It's about information.
Millenniums, it's all about the Benjamins.
But the good news is that the detectorists actually get the money. Remember, it's the museums have the right to purchase the item, which means the money goes to the detectorist, or the detectorist gets to keep the item. And they also share that with the landowner if there is one. So this system actually encourages people to report stuff. And the information gets put into something called the Portable Antiquities Scheme. There's a process for that. I think they have to call the county coroner. But anyway, the information is not lost. And as archaeologists, that's what we're most interested in. So the system actually works pretty well. And beyond being a win-win situation, the UK Treasure Act and the Portable Antiquities Scheme has created an actual pretty big database and valuable source of information that academic archaeologists are building into their research and reports. So, you know what? Quite frankly, a lot of archaeologists don't like detectorists. A lot of detectorists don't like archaeologists. But I think increasingly they make a good team. So I don't see why this can't be kind of a kumbaya relationship. So that's the beautiful. And there you have it. I distill the archaeology news in a very busy archaeology news month with the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.